The moment James Caldwell ordered his steak, he thought he had all the power in the room. With a wave of his hand, he signaled to Olivia Parker, the black waitress who had been serving silently at his table all evening. He wasn't bothered by her presence or by her quiet demeanor. He wasn't even bothered by the faint discomfort he could sense from the other diners. He was James Caldwell, a billionaire CEO, the man who had everything, and everyone in this restaurant was beneath him. "Bring me the steak, medium rare," he said, his voice a low growl as he leaned back in his chair, his eyes glinting with the arrogance of a man who controlled the room. He looked around at the luxurious decor, the crystal chandeliers, the marble floors, the fine china, and felt the weight of his wealth and power. This was his world. Olivia, standing quietly at the side, could have been invisible for all the attention he gave her. She moved to the kitchen to place the order, but something shifted inside her. She was used to being overlooked, underestimated. But not tonight. Tonight, she would make her presence known. Olivia had always believed in the power of silence. She had learned long ago that sometimes silence speaks louder than words. But tonight, the silence would have to speak for more than just patience. It would speak for her dignity. As she walked back to the table with James' steak, she noticed the way he sneered at the simple elegance of her uniform, how his eyes dismissed her without even a second thought. He believed he was the master of this world, and she was just a fleeting presence. But what he didn't know, what he couldn't possibly understand, was that she had been trained in the art of reading people. And James Caldwell was no exception. As she placed the steak down in front of him, she leaned in just enough to catch his attention. His eyes flicked up at her, annoyed, as if she were disturbing him. "Anything else, sir?" she asked, her voice calm, steady. He didn't respond immediately, too busy inspecting his meal. It wasn't until she turned to walk away that she slipped the small, folded note into his lap. She did it so casually that no one else noticed, but it would be enough. James didn't think much of it until a few moments later, when his eyes fell on the note. It was simple, just a few words that could change everything. He unfolded it slowly, unsure of what to expect. "You think I'm just a servant, don't you? But you're wrong." The words hit him like a cold slap, and for the first time that evening, he felt the weight of his own arrogance. He looked up, his eyes narrowing as he searched the room. Olivia had already turned away, walking back to the kitchen with her head held high, her steps measured. It was then that he realized something had shifted. The room seemed to close in on him. His breath caught in his chest. There was no one else in the restaurant who could have written those words. It had to be her, the woman he had so casually dismissed. The power dynamics had just flipped, and for the first time, James Caldwell wasn't sure how to react. His steak was no longer the most important thing in the room. Olivia Parker had made sure of that. James Caldwell sat in stunned silence, his fingers still gripping the note Olivia had slipped into his lap. The words were seared into his mind, echoing in the quiet hum of the restaurant. "You think I'm just a servant, don't you? But you're wrong." His pulse quickened, and the glass of wine he had been holding suddenly felt heavier, as if the weight of his own arrogance was sinking in. His eyes scanned the room, looking for Olivia, but she was nowhere to be seen. She had already disappeared into the kitchen, leaving him alone with his thoughts. The clinking of silverware, the soft murmur of other patrons, all of it faded into the background. For the first time that night, James felt small. He had spent years building his empire, making deals, silencing those who dared to oppose him. But here he was, sitting at a table in a restaurant, caught off guard by a woman who, in his eyes, was nothing more than a server. And yet, the words she had written had shaken him to his core. James took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. He was the one in control, the one who called the shots. But Olivia had flipped that narrative. She had spoken without saying a word. Her silence was more powerful than any words he could muster. The restaurant around him seemed to close in. He could feel the eyes of the other diners on him, though no one was paying him direct attention. It was as if they all knew something had changed, but no one dared to say it. James shifted in his seat, his mind racing. He needed to regain control, to assert himself again. He wasn't going to let this moment define him. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized something had shifted inside him. He had been rude, dismissive, condescending. And Olivia had seen through it all. She had seen something in him that no one else had. He felt a pang of guilt, something unfamiliar, and it gnawed at him. He had spent his life surrounded by yes-men, people who catered to his every whim. But Olivia wasn't one of them. She had spoken up, in the most subtle, yet profound, way. And now, James wasn't sure how to fix it. The waiter came over to clear the plates, and for a brief moment, James looked up, trying to gather himself. The waiter's face was unreadable, but James could sense the shift in the air. It was as if everyone in the room had sensed the same thing. He wasn't the most powerful person in this space anymore. He wasn't the one who had the final word. He could feel it. The silence was no longer comfortable. It wasn't the silence of someone who had it all figured out. It was the silence of someone who had just been exposed, who was no longer sure of their place in the world. Olivia had left him with a puzzle, and he wasn't sure how to solve it. The meal, the conversation, everything that had seemed so important just moments ago, felt irrelevant now. He had been so focused on his own superiority, on the idea that he controlled the world around him, that he had missed something. He had missed the truth that Olivia, the woman he had dismissed as nothing more than a server, was the one who held the real power in this room. She had exposed him, not with loud words or grand gestures, but with a simple note. And now, James found himself wondering how he could ever go back to being the man he was before. Olivia wasn't just a server. She was a mirror, showing him who he really was, and it was a reflection he didn't like. He sat back in his chair, his mind still racing, as the weight of the moment settled in. He had spent years thinking he could buy anything, control anything, but in that simple note, Olivia had taken everything from him. She had reminded him of something he had long forgotten. That true power doesn't come from wealth or status. It comes from something deeper. It comes from the ability to see others, to respect them, to understand their worth. And in that moment, James realized he had been blind to it all. Olivia Parker had changed the game, and James Caldwell had no choice but to sit there, in the quiet of the restaurant, and confront the uncomfortable truth. The restaurant had quieted down as the night wore on, the hum of conversation fading into the soft clink of silverware. James Caldwell sat at his table, the weight of the note Olivia had given him still hanging in the air. He felt the eyes of the other diners on him, though no one said a word. It was as if they could sense the shift, the tension that had silently woven itself into the room. The power dynamics had changed, and no one dared to acknowledge it directly. James shifted uncomfortably in his chair, trying to return to the confident, unshakable businessman he was known to be. But the more he tried to push the feeling away, the more it crept in. Olivia Parker had exposed something in him, something he didn't want to confront. He had spent his life chasing power, wealth, and control. He had built an empire on the belief that he could bend the world to his will. But what if he had been wrong? What if true power wasn't about money or status, but about something deeper, something that transcended all of that? His mind raced as he replayed the moment the note had slipped into his lap. The message wasn't just a simple insult or challenge. It was a mirror. It was a reflection of his own arrogance, his disregard for those who didn't share his position in life. For the first time, James realized how small he had made himself. In his pursuit of dominance, he had dismissed Olivia, a woman he saw as beneath him, without ever truly seeing her. He had reduced her to a role, a job, without ever considering her humanity. And in that simple act of slipping him a note, Olivia had reminded him of something he had forgotten, something vital. As James sat there, the silence around him felt suffocating. The lavish restaurant, once a symbol of his power, now seemed cold and empty. He was surrounded by opulence, but all of it felt hollow. The wealth, the influence, the recognition, it was all meaningless in the face of the truth Olivia had shown him. He glanced around the room, but Olivia was nowhere to be seen. She had vanished into the kitchen, no doubt continuing her work as if nothing had happened. But for James, everything had changed. He didn't know what to do with this newfound awareness, this unsettling realization that the world he had so carefully crafted was based on a lie. He had built his empire by stepping on others, by treating people like tools to be used, and now he was left to question everything. The image of Olivia's face, calm and composed, flashed in his mind. She wasn't rattled by his insults, wasn't affected by his dismissiveness. She had remained steadfast, even in the face of his arrogance. James envied her strength. He felt a deep, gnawing sense of shame. This wasn't how he wanted to be remembered. He didn't want to be the man who crushed others to get ahead. He didn't want to be the man who thought he could control the world. He wanted something more, something meaningful. As the evening continued, James found himself lost in thought. He couldn't shake the feeling that Olivia had seen something in him that he hadn't seen in himself. She had seen the flaws in his character, the cracks in his armor, and she had exposed them without uttering a single word. The note was enough. The realization was enough. He had spent his life looking for validation from people who didn't matter. He had surrounded himself with yes-men and sycophants, people who told him what he wanted to hear, but never the truth. But Olivia had given him the truth. And now, James Caldwell was left to figure out how to live with it. The evening wore on, but for James, it felt like time had slowed. The world around him seemed distant, disconnected, as if he were living in a fog. Olivia had opened his eyes, and now he had to decide what to do with that vision. He could go back to his old ways, to the world of power and control, but something told him that path would never satisfy him again. He could never return to the man he had been. And maybe, just maybe, that was a good thing. James Caldwell sat at the table, the evening dragging on with a strange, uneasy stillness. The weight of the note Olivia had slipped him lingered heavily in his chest. He had tried to shake it off, to return to his usual arrogance, but the more he thought about it, the deeper the realization sank in. He was no longer sure of himself in the way he had been just a few hours ago. As he glanced around the room, he noticed how everything seemed to feel just slightly off. The golden chandeliers, the polished marble floors, the laughter of the other patrons, it all seemed too distant, too hollow. The same world that once felt like his kingdom now felt like a cage. Olivia had exposed something in him that he had never wanted to acknowledge. He had spent years climbing the corporate ladder, securing business deals, flaunting his power and wealth, but now, it all seemed meaningless. What was the point of having all the money in the world if it meant losing touch with the very essence of humanity? The more James thought about Olivia's quiet strength, the more he realized that she had something he had never truly understood: self-respect. She didn't need to shout or demand attention. She didn't need to use her position to assert herself. She had simply acted. The power she had wielded had been quiet, unassuming, yet devastatingly effective. It had been her silence that had shaken him to the core. It had been her simple refusal to accept his condescension that had left him speechless. James found himself wondering how many other people like Olivia were out there, silently enduring the slights, the insults, the unfairness of the world, never once raising their voice, yet still holding an unshakable power. He felt a strange, humbling respect for her. Olivia had reminded him that the world wasn't divided between the powerful and the powerless. There were layers to this world, and real strength didn't always come from wealth or status. It came from within, from a person's ability to stand tall, to hold their ground, to quietly command respect without ever demanding it. He thought back to his own life, to the people he had stepped on to get ahead. He thought about how he had treated people like Olivia, how he had dismissed them, how he had built his empire by reducing others to mere tools. He felt sick to his stomach. James had always believed that people like him, wealthy, powerful, influential, were meant to control the world. But in that one simple moment, Olivia had shown him that true power came from understanding the value of others, from respecting them, not using them. It was a lesson he hadn't wanted to learn, but one he would never forget. The evening wore on, but James couldn't focus on the conversations around him. His mind kept drifting back to Olivia. What had she meant by that note? What had she seen in him that he had never seen in himself? He was no longer the man who thought he could control everything. He had been humbled by someone he had once considered beneath him. It was a humbling experience, one that James never imagined he would encounter. The waiter came by once more to check on him, but James barely acknowledged him. He didn't have the energy to engage in small talk, not now. Not after everything that had unfolded. The meal was forgotten, the drink was untouched. All he could think about was how Olivia had managed to do what no one else had. She had forced him to look inward, to confront the man he had become. He could hear her voice in his head now, not speaking to him directly, but speaking to the part of him he had buried deep inside. The part of him that knew that money and power weren't the things that made a person truly strong. Olivia had stripped away the layers of arrogance and pride, leaving him with nothing but the truth. He wasn't sure how to move forward, but he knew one thing for certain. He couldn't go back to the man he had been before. Olivia had changed something inside him. She had shown him a new way of seeing the world. He just hoped that, somehow, he could learn to embrace it. James sat at his table, feeling the weight of the evening settle deeper into his bones. The once celebrated luxury of the restaurant seemed to have lost its luster, its grandeur now overshadowed by the thoughts swirling in his mind. Olivia Parker's simple act had cracked the polished surface of his world, revealing cracks he hadn't even known were there. He had always prided himself on being in control, on holding the reins of his life so tightly that nothing could slip through. But tonight, everything had slipped. The arrogance he had worn like armor was gone, replaced by a humbling awareness that he didn't know how to process. He had built his empire with ruthless precision, but now, he wondered what it was all for. What had he gained if it meant losing his connection to the people around him, to the very essence of respect and decency? The other diners in the restaurant continued their conversations, unaware of the shift that had occurred in the space between them. James could hear their laughter, the clinking of glasses, but it all felt distant, muffled. His focus was inward now, and the more he examined his life, the more questions seemed to arise. Olivia's note had done something to him, something he couldn't quite explain. It had opened a door inside his mind that he had locked away a long time ago. Her simple words had forced him to see beyond the power he had accumulated, to see the people he had overlooked, dismissed, and devalued over the years. He had spent so much time building a fortress around himself, but what good was a fortress if it kept everyone, including the truth, out? Olivia's quiet defiance, her refusal to be diminished, had been the key that unlocked that door. He had never seen anyone like her before, someone who didn't need to shout, didn't need to fight for attention. She had spoken volumes with silence. Her strength wasn't in grand gestures or displays of power. It was in her ability to stand her ground, to quietly command respect without asking for it. James had always thought that power was about dominance, about bending others to your will. But Olivia had shown him that power could be something else entirely. It could be grace. It could be quiet confidence. And it could be earned, not through force, but through self-respect. He sat back in his chair, his fingers tapping lightly on the edge of his glass as he mulled over the thought. He was used to making decisions, to being the one who called the shots. But tonight, he was the one left questioning everything. He realized that he had never truly respected others for who they were, only for what they could offer him. He had built relationships on transactions, on what he could get in return. But now he wondered if that was enough. He had a reputation as a powerful CEO, but what did that really mean if it didn't come with genuine connections, with real understanding of the people around him? He glanced around the room again, his gaze lingering on the other patrons. They were still oblivious to the internal battle he was facing. To them, James Caldwell was just another wealthy, successful man. But to him, tonight had revealed a harsh truth. Success without empathy, without respect for others, was empty. As the evening wore on, James couldn't shake the feeling that he had reached a crossroads. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew he couldn't go back to the person he had been before. Olivia had taught him that. He didn't know if he could undo the damage he had done over the years, but he knew he had to start somewhere. For the first time in his life, he wasn't concerned with making deals or expanding his empire. He was concerned with something deeper. He was concerned with being a better person. And as he sat there, reflecting on the lessons he had learned, he knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy. But for the first time in a long time, he was ready to walk it. The days that followed were a blur for James Caldwell. He tried to return to his normal routine, but it was as if a shadow had settled over everything. His meetings, once filled with the usual banter and posturing, now felt hollow. The numbers, the strategies, the business deals, they all seemed insignificant. The only thing that mattered now was the realization that had struck him so suddenly, so completely. He had been living a life that was shallow, self-centered, and disconnected from the very people who made everything possible. He had built his empire on the backs of others, never once stopping to consider who they were or what they felt. It had always been about winning, about conquering, about staying ahead. But now, those victories felt meaningless. The respect he had sought from the world, the accolades and the power, now seemed like nothing more than an illusion. The real victories were the ones he had ignored: human connections, respect, empathy. And now, he found himself longing for those things, things he had spent years overlooking. His thoughts kept drifting back to Olivia Parker. She had been a mirror, showing him who he really was. And that reflection wasn't flattering. He couldn't stop thinking about how he had dismissed her, how he had assumed she was just another person in the service industry, just another face to ignore. But she wasn't. She was someone who had seen through the layers of his arrogance, someone who had made him face the reality of his own actions. He wondered if she knew the impact she had had on him, if she realized that a simple note had caused him to question everything. He hadn't felt like this in years, vulnerable, unsure, and questioning his place in the world. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that Olivia had shown him something he had never truly seen before: the power of humility. It wasn't about being the loudest in the room, the wealthiest, or the most influential. It was about being grounded, about understanding the worth of every person, regardless of their status. James had always thought that strength came from dominance, from controlling the narrative. But Olivia had taught him that true strength came from within, from being true to yourself and others. He knew he couldn't undo the past, couldn't fix the damage he had done, but he also knew that he didn't have to stay the same. Change wasn't easy, but it was possible. And for the first time, he was ready to try. James knew he couldn't do it alone. He needed to make amends, to rebuild relationships that had been strained by his own arrogance. He had already begun making small changes in his day-to-day life. He was listening more, observing more, trying to understand the people around him in ways he never had before. But he knew that real change would take time, and it would take effort. He couldn't expect to change overnight. But he also knew that he had to start somewhere. And for him, that somewhere was understanding. It was respecting the people he had once overlooked, seeing them as equals, as partners, not just tools to further his own success. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that his journey wasn't just about making money or gaining power. It was about becoming the kind of person who could truly connect with others, someone who wasn't just respected for what he had, but for who he was. As the weeks went by, James made it a point to reach out to the people he had once dismissed. He started small, making sure to remember names, to ask about their families, to listen to their opinions. He didn't expect instant results, and he didn't expect to be forgiven right away. But he was willing to put in the work. He had a long road ahead, but for the first time, he felt like he was on the right path. Olivia Parker had given him a lesson he would never forget, one that would shape the rest of his life. She had made him see that power wasn't just about control. It was about understanding, empathy, and respect. And as he looked ahead, James knew that he had a long way to go. But he was ready for it. The man he had been no longer existed. And the man he was becoming was someone he could finally respect. James Caldwell sat in his office the following week, a stack of reports before him, but his mind was elsewhere. For the first time in years, he couldn't focus on the numbers, the deals, the acquisitions. The empire he had spent his life building felt distant, like a fog he couldn't shake off. His thoughts kept drifting back to that moment in the restaurant with Olivia Parker, the way she had made him see himself for the first time in a way he hadn't wanted to. The realization that the power he had sought for so long was hollow. He wasn't sure how to explain it, but everything had changed after that evening. His staff had noticed the difference. His assistant, Carla, who had worked with him for over a decade, remarked how he had become more patient, more considerate in his decisions. She couldn't quite place it, but she noticed the subtle shifts. He didn't interrupt meetings as much. He listened more. He began asking people how their days were, remembering names, remembering faces. Small gestures, but to James, they were huge. The walls he had built around himself were slowly coming down. It wasn't just about business anymore. It was about connecting with people, seeing them for who they were, not just for what they could do for him. And the change was starting to feel real. Still, there was one thing that weighed heavily on his mind: Olivia. He hadn't seen her since that night. He wasn't even sure if she remembered him, or if she had any idea of the impact she had had on his life. But James needed to know. He needed to understand how she had seen through him so effortlessly. There was no way he could go back to being the same person after everything that had happened. He had to find her, to thank her, to apologize for the way he had treated her. It was a strange feeling, one he hadn't felt in years: vulnerability. And yet, it felt right. So, he did something he had never done before. He left his office early and went to the restaurant. He didn't have a plan. He didn't know what he was going to say when he saw her. He only knew that he had to do something. When he arrived at the restaurant, it was quieter than he remembered, the late afternoon light casting soft shadows over the tables. He approached the hostess, his heart pounding in his chest. "I'm looking for Olivia Parker," he said, his voice steady but uncertain. The hostess smiled politely and nodded. "She's on shift today. I'll let her know you're here." James stood there, feeling like a fool, but he didn't care. He had to face this. A few minutes later, Olivia appeared, walking through the kitchen door, her uniform as neat as always, her eyes scanning the room. When they met his, there was no surprise, no anger, just a quiet recognition. She stopped in front of him, her posture straight, her expression neutral. "James Caldwell," she said, her voice calm. "I didn't expect to see you here." For a moment, neither of them spoke. It was as if the entire restaurant had faded away, leaving just the two of them standing in that space. "I owe you an apology," James finally said, his voice softer than he intended. Olivia raised an eyebrow, but didn't interrupt. "The way I treated you that night. I didn't see you. I didn't see the person standing in front of me. I saw only what I wanted to see." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "You made me realize something important. Something I had been blind to for far too long." Olivia's gaze remained steady, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes. Curiosity, maybe. "I've spent my life building something that I thought would give me meaning," he continued. "But what you showed me was that meaning isn't about wealth or power. It's about how we treat others. It's about respect. And I've spent far too long forgetting that." Olivia stood silently, her eyes never leaving his. She didn't say anything right away, and James didn't expect her to. He wasn't sure what he wanted from this moment, but it was enough to say the words, to finally acknowledge the lesson she had taught him. After a long pause, Olivia spoke. "You're not the first person to come in here thinking they can treat others however they like," she said quietly. "But you're the first one who's ever said something like this. That counts for something." James felt a weight lift from his chest, though he knew it wasn't over. It would take time to rebuild what he had broken, but this was a start. "Thank you," he said, the words coming easily now. Olivia gave a small nod. "You're welcome." She turned to walk away, but then stopped. "And James." He looked up. "Don't forget that lesson." With that, she was gone, disappearing into the kitchen. James stood there for a moment, feeling the weight of her words. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, he felt like he was ready to face it. He had learned a hard lesson, but it was one that would stay with him forever. Olivia Parker had changed him, and he was going to make sure it wasn't in vain. The weeks that followed Olivia's brief encounter with James Caldwell felt like a quiet turning point in both their lives. For James, the shift in his perspective continued to unfold, slowly but steadily. He found himself waking up each day with a new sense of purpose, no longer driven by the need for validation from external sources, but by the desire to live with more integrity and understanding. His decisions, both in business and in life, began to reflect the lessons he had learned from Olivia's silent strength. He wasn't perfect, and he knew it. But for the first time, he felt like he was on the path to becoming the man he had always hoped to be, not just in terms of success, but in terms of how he treated the people around him. Work became less about his dominance and more about collaboration. He sought input from people at all levels, from his top executives to the junior employees who rarely got a voice in the decision-making process. It was a humbling experience, one that required him to set aside his pride and listen, to truly listen. And it wasn't just in the office. James found himself reaching out to people he had once overlooked. He reconnected with old friends, apologized to former colleagues he had brushed aside, and even made time for charity events, something he had never found important before. But as the days passed, there was still one thing that lingered in the back of his mind: Olivia. He hadn't seen her since that day at the restaurant. His life had moved on, but she had left an imprint on his soul that he couldn't ignore. He knew that he owed her more than just a thank you. He owed her an acknowledgement of the impact she had had on him. He had spent so much of his life assuming that power came from controlling others, from being untouchable, but she had shown him the true essence of power, the ability to see others, to treat them with dignity, and to embrace the quiet strength that often goes unnoticed. And so, one afternoon, after much contemplation, James found himself walking into the restaurant. Again. This time, however, he wasn't there as a guest. He was there to find Olivia, to express his gratitude in a way that went beyond words. He stepped through the familiar glass doors, feeling a mixture of anticipation and nervousness. The restaurant, still as elegant as ever, held a sense of familiarity, but it was different now. The power dynamics had shifted, at least in his own mind. As he approached the hostess, his voice steady, he asked for Olivia. She was on shift, as expected, and after a brief moment, the hostess gestured toward the back of the room. James walked toward her, his heart beating faster with each step. He saw her in the distance, her posture as poised as ever, moving between tables with quiet confidence. When their eyes met, Olivia paused for just a moment, as if recognizing him, though she didn't speak immediately. James felt the weight of the past few weeks, the changes he had made, and the growth he had experienced. He didn't know if Olivia had seen it, but he hoped she would. "Olivia," he said, his voice calm but full of sincerity. She turned to him fully, offering him a slight smile, but said nothing, waiting for him to continue. "I just wanted to say thank you. I know I can't undo the past, but I've changed because of you. You made me realize that there's more to life than power and success. You reminded me that true strength comes from humility and respect." Olivia didn't respond right away, and for a moment, they simply stood there, facing each other. James wasn't sure if she would say anything at all, but the silence wasn't uncomfortable. It felt like a moment of understanding between them. Finally, she spoke, her voice as calm as always. "I didn't do it for you," she said, her words simple but weighted with meaning. "I didn't need your gratitude. I just did what I felt was right." James nodded, understanding the depth of her words. She hadn't done it for recognition, and in that moment, he understood the true lesson. He had been looking for validation his entire life, but Olivia had shown him that the real fulfillment came from doing what was right, not for applause, but because it was the right thing to do. "I know," he said, softly, "and I won't forget it." She gave him a small nod before turning back to the table she had been approaching, but this time, James didn't feel invisible or dismissed. He felt a sense of peace, knowing that the man he was becoming was more in alignment with who he truly wanted to be. Olivia had taught him that the true measure of a person wasn't in their wealth or their power, but in how they treated others. And as he watched her walk away, James couldn't help but smile. He had learned a powerful lesson, and for the first time, he felt truly free. As the days passed, James Caldwell found himself looking at life through a completely new lens. He spent more time observing the people around him, trying to see them for who they truly were, rather than the roles they played in his life. At work, he no longer walked into meetings with the same air of superiority he once did. He listened more intently, not just to the words, but to the thoughts and feelings behind them. He found himself valuing his employees in ways he had never done before. He realized that their contributions were just as important as his own, and that without their hard work and dedication, his success would have been nothing more than a hollow victory. The change wasn't always easy. There were moments when his old habits surfaced, when he felt the urge to dominate a conversation or impose his will. But those moments were becoming fewer and farther between. He was learning to fight those impulses, to let go of the need to control everything and everyone around him. And it felt liberating. Outside of work, James began to seek out more meaningful connections. He reconnected with family members he had grown distant from, making an effort to be present in their lives. He started attending charity events and volunteering his time, not because it would make him look good, but because he genuinely wanted to help. His reputation as a ruthless businessman began to soften, and people started to see a different side of him. But through it all, there was still one person he couldn't stop thinking about, Olivia. He had seen her only that one time after their brief exchange, but her impact had stayed with him. He wanted to reach out to her again, not to thank her, but to show her that he had truly learned something from their encounter. But he wasn't sure how to do it. He didn't want to come across as insincere or overbearing. He knew that some lessons had to be lived, not just said. He wasn't sure if Olivia would ever see him as anything more than the man who had treated her like an invisible servant, but he hoped that in time, she would see the changes in him. He had changed, after all. It wasn't just about his behavior in the boardroom or how he interacted with his staff. It was about who he was at his core. And James Caldwell had learned that being a good leader, being a good person, was about more than just business success. It was about being genuine, about treating people with kindness and respect, about valuing them for their humanity rather than their utility. As time went on, James found himself in a place of quiet contentment. His company continued to grow, but it wasn't the same kind of growth it had been before. Now, there was a sense of purpose behind everything he did, a purpose that went beyond making money or securing power. He was living a life that was more in alignment with the person he truly wanted to be. And that, he realized, was worth more than any business deal or acquisition. He had learned the hard way that power wasn't something to be grasped or hoarded. It wasn't about dominance or control. True power came from understanding, empathy, and respect for others. And in that understanding, James Caldwell had found peace. One afternoon, as he walked through the city, his phone buzzed in his pocket. It was a message from an unknown number. When he opened it, his heart skipped a beat. It was from Olivia. "I heard what you've been doing. I'm glad to see you've made changes. It's good to see someone finally realize that it's not just about the bottom line. I hope you keep it up." James smiled to himself, feeling a warmth spread through him. The message was simple, but it meant the world to him. Olivia had seen him. She had noticed the changes. And for that, he was grateful. He knew that the road ahead would still have its challenges. He was still learning, still growing. But for the first time, he wasn't afraid of the journey. He had a new understanding of what it meant to be truly powerful, and he was ready to embrace it. And with that, James Caldwell knew that he had finally found the peace he had been searching for all along.